Good afternoon. It is somewhat alarming, actually, to hear from many of you what a dirty word architect is. But, you know, joking aside, there's definitely improvements to be made. And I think the goal is, as has been said many times, we need to work better together. We need to get fire strategy into design earlier. And we need to have good working relationships where we're all working towards the same goal with the same vision of creating great buildings and spaces and safe spaces for people. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk to you today a bit about sustainability and innovation from our practices perspective. We've got a practice in Manchester, we've got jobs in Greater Manchester, Stockport, Lake District and Lancashire. And it is a huge privilege to work in a profession which has an amazing opportunity to improve our towns and cities. And we're passionate about using architecture as an agent for positive change, but we're also acutely aware of the negative impact of our industry on the environment, the construction industry, which Steve outlined many of the statistics for us just now. In building and construction, we're responsible for way over 30% of global energy consumption and the associated emissions. So what are we doing about that? Since the Paris Agreement in 2015, the World Green Building Council stipulated that 100% of all new buildings must be zero carbon by 2030. And 100% of all buildings, that's existing and new buildings, must be zero carbon by 2050. So it's worth clarifying at this point the meaning of zero carbon from the World Building Council's point of view. It's a building that's highly energy efficient and fully powered from on and off-site renewable energy. So it's different from net zero energy buildings, which generate all of their energy needs on site. Many people are now talking about net positive energy buildings, which actually give energy back, but we're not going to talk about that today. So let's see how we're getting on. Someone counted last year, apparently, and there are 500 net zero energy commercial buildings and 2,000 net zero energy housing units. That is much less than 1% of buildings worldwide. I've just put some emojis on there to help you to relate the appropriate feelings to that. So in summary, we've got a huge mountain to climb in a very short time. 2030 is 12 years away. So we know the need, we know the target. Why is the uptake of zero carbon buildings so sluggish? The World Green Building Council wrote this report from thousands to billions, where they identified three topics which they thought were the main barriers to the adoption of zero carbon buildings. The first one is perception. People think that it's technically difficult, expensive, there's ambiguity over the requirements and parameters, and there's general confusion over what to comply with. And as a designer in the industry, I would say that is correct. There's technical barriers. Zero carbon buildings are high performance and high quality. They have to be to perform. So new skills and good workmanship are required, and that's across everyone in the industry: architects, other consultants, contractors, builders. And the third one is obviously financial. So there's no point pretending that low energy building doesn't cost more. That is, unless you take the long-term view. But unfortunately in the UK today, we haven't managed to really reconcile short-term profit-making with long-term public good. And that has been talked about a lot, really, in relation to fire. So we need to get into a position where decisions are made for the end user and the environment, rather than just cost and time and short-term gain. And that means relooking at procurement, really, which is another topic altogether. So having highlighted the barriers, what is the solution? The World Green Building Council believes that it is possible to collectively propel the market from under 1% of all buildings achieving net zero carbon to the 100% needed by 2050 by introducing a voluntary net zero certification and through coordinating efforts from three major groups: businesses, government and NGO. Now, for very human reasons, we think that this voluntary certification is highly unlikely to bring about the massive change that's required. And I won't ask you for a show of hands, but if you could just think to yourself about what personal sacrifices you would be prepared to make towards the pursuit of this global goal. If you're anything like me, it's likely that you struggle to realise and visualise your individual impact on this enormous task. But there's another reason. This is looking down the Duddon Valley in the Lake District, and it's probably one of my favourite places to be. It's beautiful. It's nature. Martin Brown wrote a book called Future Restorative, which is actually about net positive buildings. And he said, having lost our real connection with nature, we have lost our respect for it and are much likelier to tolerate damage done to it. So although this is one of my favourite places, it's actually not somewhere I get to spend much time. Because in fact, probably much like you, I spend a lot of my time behind a computer screen. In the UK, we spend 90% of our time indoors, so we're quite disconnected from nature now. The bottom line is, we're all well aware of the issues and what needs to be done, but statistics don't talk to the heart, and many people aren't moved to act. We need government incentives and progressive policies to lead the way. Unfortunately, in the UK, obviously, the Code for Sustainable Homes and the 2016 Zero Carbon Homes target has been abolished. So as designers, we're in limbo yet again. And as a practice, we find ourselves wondering, how do we make an impact? We can't impose standards on our clients and make them pay for it if they are not personally convicted by the cause. And we've realised as a practice that in order to innovate, we have to look back, really far back, and back to when architects as we know them didn't even exist. When people built structures to fundamentally protect themselves from the elements and provide shelter, they used materials within the vicinity that they could walk and carry, and worked with the physical landscape and the climate to keep them as warm and as dry as they possibly could. Building then was an intuitive response to the physical surroundings. And because they had limited means of creating heat and light and ventilation, they used what was passively available to them. This is the Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado, and it was home to the Pueblo people about 800 years ago. And architecture for them was what I just described. They built homes and towns within the alcoves of these gorges, and it was highly sustainable, even though they definitely didn't have a word for climate change then. So they worked and lived within a short distance of each other. They made buildings out of materials that were within walking distance. These are their homes within the gorges that I just showed you there. And they're made of materials like sandstone, and the mortar there is water and ash, and they use timber, all readily locally available. And though this is a terrible photograph, it really brilliantly describes how clever that kind of architecture is and how much it uses what's passively available. A few years ago, I worked in Brisbane in Australia, and it struck me how far we've come from this intuitive method of building. Architects and technology are very clever these days, and we like to make big shiny things. We don't use local materials because we can transport them from all over the world. We can make what we want. We don't need to really control the internal environment because we can always air condition it and heat it. We expect it all at the world's expense. And as a result, or the cause, is that architecture looks very similar wherever you go, and it's not really linked to its physical context. So obviously this is London, this is Brisbane, two completely different cultures and climates, two very similar types of building. So in our cleverness, we've forgotten how to design buildings which are truly rooted in their unique place, and make the most of the passive energy available. So how am I suggesting that the Misi Verde way of life is even relevant today? So don't hear what I'm not saying. Our lifestyle demands are so much greater than they were then, and it would be ridiculous to suggest that we built out of all materials that were within 1 mile of a site. I'm also not saying that we should disregard our contemporary technology. In fact, I think our buildings should embrace the possibilities of technologies much more, whether that's modular building or prefabrication, machine engineering. That is all part of our contemporary context. But we do also need to pay much greater attention to place. As a practice, we've been investing in learning the Passivhaus methods and principles, which allow you to accurately calculate the energy use of your designs, and it's a fabric-first approach to designing buildings with an incredibly low energy demand. So it requires sustainability to be intrinsic to design right from the start, and you input lots of detailed data on orientation, glazing, materials, U-value, shading, surface area into a spreadsheet which looks something like this, and it spits out an energy use of the building at the end. And although this looks very complex, it's actually very simple. It means paying attention to where the sun is and using its passive energy for heat and light, making a compact form to limit heat loss from the surface area, providing suitable shading to prevent too much solar gain, and insulating to a high level, and detailing it well to prevent air leakage. It's not brain science, and the first 3 of those things that I just mentioned are completely free. So it might sound really obvious to you, but if you look around our cities, it's clear that buildings are not taking passive energy into consideration. So this fabric-first approach to design is being adopted across Europe because of progressive government policies and incentives. And it's the most cost-effective way of designing sustainably and creating a legacy of low-energy building stock. And it goes a long way towards alleviating fuel poverty. So, can we reach 100% zero-carbon buildings by 2050? We believe that the first step towards meeting this target is a passive one, not a passive in the do-nothing sense, but a passive in the use what we've got and make the most of it sense. So just to leave you with a few of our practice principles, small projects matter. We think long-term about design, and we take a fabric-first approach, and we keep learning, and we always put sustainability first. So that's it for me. Thanks for listening. The question that I've got for you is, what do you think is the biggest barrier to adopting zero-carbon building? Is it A, a lack of knowledge and skills, B, the expense, or C, just general apathy amongst people? Thank you very much.